They came to him with false badges, full confidence in their power, and the intention to arrest him. But they didn't know the most important thing. There was a man standing in front of them who wore a real badge. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching the video from. The moving truck had barely pulled away when he started noticing the stares. At first, he thought he was imagining it, just the usual curiosity that came with someone new moving into the neighborhood. But then, when he stepped outside to check the mailbox, he saw it clearly. The woman across the street, watering her front lawn, abruptly turned away as if she hadn't been watching him. The man jogging past slowed just enough to give him a long, scrutinizing glance before picking up his pace again. A couple, walking their golden retriever, made no effort to return his polite nod. The air in the neighborhood was thick with something unspoken, something he hadn't expected when he signed the closing documents on his new home. This place had been marketed as an exclusive, well-maintained community, a quiet and peaceful neighborhood where people took care of their properties and respected each other. It was exactly what he had wanted: stability, security, and a home he could finally call his own after years of hard work. But now, standing on his porch, he could feel the invisible wall that had been placed around him. He tried to ignore it at first. Maybe they just weren't the friendly type. Some neighborhoods were like that. People kept to themselves, minded their business. He could respect that. He wasn't looking to become best friends with his neighbors. He just wanted a place where he could live in peace. But the subtle hostility was impossible to ignore. The silence when he walked past a group of neighbors chatting outside. The way the mailman barely made eye contact when handing over his letters. The way people crossed the street when he was out for his morning run. Then came the small but deliberate acts. His trash cans went missing. At first, he thought the waste management company had made a mistake. But when he walked the length of the street, he noticed his was the only house missing its bins. He found them a few days later, dumped in the wooded area behind the neighborhood, half buried under dead leaves. He wheeled them back, but the message was clear. Then there was the car. One morning, as he walked outside to leave for work, he saw it. Long, deep scratches running along the side of his vehicle. Someone had taken the time to drag a key or a sharp object across the paint, ruining the sleek black finish. His stomach tightened as he ran his fingers over the damage. There were no security cameras in the neighborhood, and he doubted anyone would admit to seeing anything. He called the police anyway, but as expected, there wasn't much they could do. A few days later, he found an envelope in his mailbox with no return address. Inside was a typed note on crisp white paper. "Some places aren't meant for everyone. You don't belong here." He read the words over twice, his grip tightening around the paper. His heartbeat remained steady, but a slow, simmering anger burned beneath his ribs. He had dealt with things like this before, but he had thought, no, he had hoped, he wouldn't have to deal with them here. This was supposed to be his home. And then the homeowners association stepped in. At first, it was little things. Small, official-looking letters informing him of minor infractions. His fence was too high. The color of his front door was non-compliant with the neighborhood's aesthetic. His lawn, though neatly trimmed, wasn't up to the association's expected standards. He had seen plenty of houses with worse yards, but none of them had warning letters pinned to their doors. Then the restrictions became more absurd. A letter arrived, notifying him that he was no longer permitted to park in his own driveway because his vehicle, a sleek black truck, was disruptive to the uniform visual appeal of the neighborhood. Another letter informed him that he was in violation of community rules for placing his garbage cans on the curb incorrectly. He brushed it off, refused to be intimidated. He knew what they were doing. They were pushing, waiting to see if he would push back, waiting to see if he would give up and move out. Then, one morning, he stepped outside and saw the bright orange traffic cone placed directly in the center of his driveway. Attached to it was a laminated sheet of paper that read, "Garage closed by order of the HOA." He stared at it for a long moment. Across the street, a few of his neighbors were watching from their porches. A woman in a pastel sweater, he recognized her as the one who had first ignored his wave, stood with her arms crossed, an air of satisfaction on her face. He walked over, ripped the paper from the cone, and tossed it into the nearest trash can. Then he picked up the cone itself and placed it on the sidewalk. That should have been the end of it. But the next morning, it was back, placed exactly where he had found it. And so it continued, a game, a test. Every day he would remove the cone, and every night it would reappear. Some nights he sat at his window, watching the darkened street, waiting to see who was doing it. But whoever it was, they were careful. Then, one day, they went further. When he turned on the faucet to rinse his coffee mug, nothing came out. He checked the other sinks, nothing. His first thought was a citywide outage, but when he called the water company, they told him that service to his house had been temporarily suspended at the request of the neighborhood association due to unresolved compliance issues. That was when he knew this wasn't just harassment. This was a calculated effort to force him out. And it wasn't just the HOA. A few days later, as he returned from the store, a man, one of the neighbors who had always avoided eye contact, stopped him at his driveway. He had the expression of someone pretending to be concerned, but there was something smug underneath it. "You know, a lot of people here are saying you just don't really fit in with the community," he said, rocking back on his heels. "Maybe it would be easier if you—" He shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished, but the implication hung in the air between them. He smiled, slow and deliberate. Some people should mind their own damn business. The man's face twitched with irritation, but he turned and walked away. That night, as he lay in bed, he realized something. They weren't going to stop. This wasn't just about making him uncomfortable. They were going to keep escalating, pushing him further, forcing his hand. And he knew without a doubt that they were already planning their next move. He woke up to the sound of his phone vibrating on the nightstand. It was early, too early for anyone he knew to be calling. He groggily reached for it, glancing at the screen. It was an unknown number, but something in his gut told him to answer. "Man, you need to get home. Now." The voice on the other end was low, urgent. He recognized it. It was one of the few neighbors who hadn't turned their back on him, a guy named Marcus who lived a few streets over. "What's going on?" "The police are at your house. 2 cars, and guess who's standing out front talking to them like she owns the place?" The sleep cleared from his mind instantly. He threw on a shirt, grabbed his keys, and was out the door within minutes. As he turned the corner onto his street, his stomach clenched. 2 patrol cars were parked in front of his house, their lights flashing. And, just as Marcus had warned, there she was. Karen, standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, wearing that same smug expression she always did when she thought she had won. He pulled into his driveway, parked, and stepped out. The 2 officers turned toward him immediately. He could tell from their body language that they weren't aggressive, weren't ready to escalate things, but they were cautious. They had been called here for something serious. The taller officer, the one with the notepad in hand, spoke first. "Sir, we received a report of suspicious activity involving a firearm at this residence." He exhaled slowly, keeping his expression neutral. He had been expecting something like this, but the fact that they had gone straight to fabricating a weapons complaint meant they were getting desperate. He turned his head just enough to look at Karen. She was playing her role well, looking at the officers with a mixture of concern and determination. If he hadn't known better, he might have even believed she was genuinely afraid. "I bet the report came from this lady right here," he said, keeping his voice calm. Karen gasped, putting a hand on her chest as if she had just been insulted. "I only reported what I heard. Some people saw suspicious movements around your property and got worried. I was just being a responsible neighbor." The officers exchanged glances. They were already tired of this. He could see it in the way their shoulders sagged slightly, in the way the one with the notepad barely even pretended to be writing anything down. This wasn't the first time they had been dragged into HOA drama, and it wouldn't be the last. The second officer, younger, clearly wanting to wrap things up, sighed. "Since there's no real threat, we're going to register this as a false alarm. But just for the record, ma'am." He turned toward Karen, his tone just a little sharper now. "Making false reports can lead to legal consequences." For the first time since he had met her, Karen looked genuinely nervous. She opened her mouth to protest, but something in the way the officer was watching her made her hesitate. Instead, she just huffed, crossed her arms, and turned away. The officers left soon after, and Karen shot him one last glare before disappearing into her house. He stood in his driveway for a long moment, watching her door. He had won this round, but he knew it wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat. She would try again. She just had to figure out a new way to do it. The answer came just a few days later. It started early in the morning, just as he was finishing his coffee. He heard the rumbling of a heavy truck pulling up in front of his house. When he looked out the window, he saw a team of workers getting out, dressed in uniforms, carrying tools and cones. They looked like they were preparing for serious construction work. His first thought was that they had the wrong house. Then he saw Karen standing across the street, arms crossed, watching. That was all he needed to know. He stepped outside and walked up to the lead worker, who was holding a clipboard and looking at his front yard like it was a problem to be solved. "What's this?" The man looked up, professional but slightly confused. "We're here to start repairs on the underground water pipes. Got a report of a leak." There was no leak. He knew that. His plumbing was fine, and he also knew exactly who had reported this non-existent issue. "Let me guess," he said, keeping his voice level. "The work order was signed by Karen Thompson." The man flipped through his papers, scanning the pages, then nodded. "Yeah, came directly from the HOA president." That was it. That was the last straw. "Pack it up," he said. The man hesitated. "Sir, we're already here. We need to—" "You need to leave." The lead worker opened his mouth, clearly about to argue, but then he saw what was in his hand. His badge. There was a shift in the air, a moment of realization. The man's eyes widened, and he swallowed. "All right, guys," he called back to his crew. "We're done here. Pack it up." Karen was already marching toward him, her face twisted with frustration. "You can't do this," she snapped. "Do what?" He tilted his head slightly, watching her. "You can't stop an HOA-mandated repair." He exhaled sharply, almost laughing. "Karen, you don't have the authority to dig up my yard, and if you try something like this again, I will personally have you arrested for trespassing and fraud." She went still, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. For the first time, she had no comeback, no argument, no threats. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're done, Karen." Her face turned red, but she didn't say another word. Instead, she spun around and stomped back into her house, slamming the door behind her. He stood there for a moment, watching as the workers packed up their tools and drove off. The street was quiet again, for now. The next letter from the HOA arrived a week later. This time it was different. This wasn't another fine, another passive-aggressive warning. It was a notice of disciplinary review. They were trying to expel him from the neighborhood. It was almost laughable. The HOA had no legal authority to evict homeowners. They didn't own his property. They didn't control his mortgage. But Karen didn't care about that. She was throwing everything she had at him, hoping something would stick. That week, the whispers from the other neighbors grew louder. He caught the looks, the quiet conversations that stopped when he walked past. Even people who had previously ignored him were now actively avoiding him, clearly afraid of being seen talking to him. Then, at the grocery store, an older woman, one of Karen's allies no doubt, walked up to him, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "You know," she said, "a lot of people are saying you don't really belong here. Maybe it would be easier if you just moved." He smiled at her, slow and deliberate. Some people should worry more about their own lives. She flushed, her mouth opening as if she wanted to say more, but she didn't. She turned and walked away. That Friday evening, the disciplinary meeting was held. He went just for the pleasure of watching them fail. And fail they did. The community hall was packed, filled with familiar faces that had spent the past few weeks pretending he didn't exist. Most of the neighbors had shown up, their expressions ranging from eager anticipation to uneasy discomfort. At the front of the room, seated behind a long table covered in neatly stacked papers, sat the HOA board. And in the center of it all, leading the charge as always, was Karen. She wore her usual self-satisfied expression, that smug look of someone who believed they had already won before the game had even begun. A few of her closest allies sat beside her, mirroring her confidence, their backs straight, their hands folded neatly in front of them. A gavel rested on the table, as if they were presiding over some kind of court hearing rather than a neighborhood meeting. He took his seat near the front, arms crossed, leaning back slightly as he watched Karen clear her throat and begin. "We're here tonight to discuss an issue that has become increasingly concerning to this community," she said, her voice slow and measured, as if addressing a room full of unruly children. "The behavior of one particular resident has been disruptive, aggressive, and entirely out of line with the values we hold dear." There were nods of agreement from certain sections of the crowd. Others remained silent, watching with unreadable expressions. She continued, shuffling through the papers in front of her. "We have documented repeated violations, including failure to comply with HOA standards, obstruction of official community maintenance, and—" She paused dramatically, looking up as if the next part was particularly egregious. "Open hostility toward members of this neighborhood." He let out a slow breath, feeling the familiar burn of frustration rise in his chest. This was a show. A desperate attempt at regaining control after every one of her previous schemes had failed. He wasn't just dealing with a woman who wanted him gone. He was dealing with someone who couldn't stand the idea of losing. He stayed quiet, letting her go on, listening as she listed out a ridiculous array of fabricated complaints, from refusing to attend HOA meetings to verbally intimidating other residents. Finally, she reached the end of her monologue and folded her hands together. Given the severity of these issues, we believe it is in the best interest of the community that this resident be removed from the neighborhood. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some people looked pleased, others looked uncertain. A few seemed outright uncomfortable. He waited a beat before finally speaking. "Are you done?" His voice was calm, level, but loud enough that it cut through the murmurs. Karen's smile faltered just slightly. "Excuse me?" "You want to kick me out of the neighborhood," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Do you even have the authority to do that?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "The HOA has the right to take action against residents who refuse to comply with—" "This isn't a gated community, Karen," he interrupted. "You don't own my house. You don't control my mortgage. And this meeting," he gestured vaguely to the gathered neighbors, "means absolutely nothing." Silence. A few people shifted in their seats. Karen's allies glanced at her uncertainly, realizing that, for all her bluster, she had no real power to enforce any of this. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time since he had moved in, she looked like she wasn't entirely sure what to say. Then, after a beat, she forced a laugh, shaking her head as if the entire conversation was beneath her. "This is absurd," she muttered. "You simply don't fit in with this community." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked onto hers. "Yeah?" He let the word hang in the air, drawing it out just enough to let the weight of it settle over the room. "I think I'm going to keep not fitting in, because I'm not going anywhere." Another wave of murmurs spread through the crowd, this time louder, more restless. Some of the neighbors who had been nodding along with Karen just minutes ago now looked doubtful. It was sinking in. There was nothing she could actually do to force him out. Karen's face turned red. Her jaw clenched. She gritted her teeth so hard he could practically hear it. She had lost, but he knew Karen. He knew her type. She wasn't the kind of person who accepted defeat, and she certainly wasn't the kind of person to back down gracefully. She had one last card to play. He found out what it was a week later when he woke up to the sound of sirens outside his house. His stomach dropped as he threw on a shirt and moved to the window. 2 county enforcement vehicles were parked at the curb, and across the street, standing just far enough to act as though she wasn't involved, was Karen. She wasn't smiling this time, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the way she watched the scene unfold. He stepped outside before the inspectors could even knock. The man in the lead, a middle-aged guy with a notepad and a stiff posture, looked at him with professional detachment. "Sir, we received a complaint about multiple structural irregularities on this property. We'll need to conduct a full inspection." It took everything in him not to laugh. "Irregularities," he repeated. The inspector glanced down at his notes. "According to the report, this residence has unauthorized construction, irregular plumbing, and a possible pest infestation." And there it was. Karen wasn't just playing neighborhood politics anymore. She wasn't just trying to annoy him into leaving. She was trying to get the authorities to condemn his house. He crossed his arms, exhaling through his nose. And who made this complaint? The inspector seemed mildly surprised, as if he had expected resistance. But there was nothing for him to find. For nearly 2 hours, they combed through the property. They measured walls, checked pipes, took photos, poked into cupboards, walked through the backyard. And all the while, Karen and a handful of her loyal followers stood at a distance, waiting for the moment they could celebrate. That moment never came. When the inspectors were done, the younger one approached him, his expression neutral. "Sir, we completed our check. We found no violations. Your property complies with all county regulations." For a brief moment, Karen's mask slipped. Her mouth opened slightly, her eyes widening just a fraction. He let himself smile. "So," he said, crossing his arms, "the complaint was completely false?" The inspector scratched his head, looking vaguely uncomfortable. "Well, technically, yes." "Good," he said, voice smooth and even, "because I'll be filing a formal complaint against the HOA for harassment and misuse of public resources." Karen's breath hitched audibly. "You're overreacting," she blurted. "It was just a safety protocol." He rolled his eyes. "Strange. The inspectors just told me my house is perfect, so either you lied or you're terrible at inspecting anything." She looked to the inspectors as if expecting them to defend her, but they only shrugged, already tired of whatever this was. As she stammered for another excuse, he pulled out his phone and made the call. Karen finally backed down, but lucky for her, it was already too late. The fallout was immediate. The county officials didn't take kindly to being used as pawns in a petty neighborhood feud. Within days, an internal review was opened against the HOA, investigating not only the false report against him but also any other potential misuse of authority. The cracks in Karen's empire began to show almost instantly. It started with small things. Residents who had once blindly followed her leadership suddenly grew hesitant. The quiet murmurs at the community meetings turned into full-blown doubts. People who had once stood at her side were now questioning whether they had been backing the wrong person all along. Then the real bombshell dropped. A full-scale audit of the HOA's finances was ordered, and it didn't take long before the discrepancies came to light. Tens of thousands of dollars were missing from the HOA's budget. Funds that were supposed to be allocated for community maintenance had mysteriously disappeared. Even worse, certain homeowners had been fined exorbitant amounts for supposed infractions that were never actually recorded anywhere. The HOA had been functioning less as a governing body and more as Karen's personal piggy bank. It wasn't just about money. Reports surfaced that Karen had been fabricating violations against residents she didn't like, using the HOA's authority to make their lives miserable. People who had been fined for things as small as having a mailbox the wrong shade of beige suddenly realized they had been scammed. One by one, former allies began to turn on her, each distancing themselves as the investigation intensified. Karen, of course, fought back. She tried to dismiss it all as misunderstandings, as clerical errors. She blamed the HOA's treasurer, then the secretary, then anyone she could find to take the fall. But it was no use. The numbers didn't lie, and neither did the mounting complaints from residents who had once kept quiet out of fear of retaliation. An emergency community meeting was called to decide the fate of the HOA board. It was standing room only, with nearly every homeowner in attendance. Karen sat at the front, her face twisted into something between defiance and desperation. She still believed she could talk her way out of this. The head of the investigative committee, a sharp-eyed woman from the county who had clearly dealt with people like Karen before, didn't let that happen. She laid out the charges in painstaking detail, showing receipts, forged documents, and fraudulent HOA fines. The final blow came when the missing money was traced back to Karen's personal bank account. The vote to remove her from office wasn't just unanimous. It was immediate. Karen didn't go quietly. She ranted, threatened lawsuits, swore she would take the entire HOA down with her if they didn't reinstate her. But no one was listening anymore. She had built her power on intimidation, on fear, on the belief that she was untouchable. And now, with the entire community watching her downfall, she was nothing. Then came the police. 2 uniformed officers arrived at the meeting, their expressions unreadable as they approached the front of the room. Karen went pale the moment she saw them. "Ma'am," one of them said, voice firm but professional, "we have a warrant for your arrest." The room went silent. Karen let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head as if this were all some kind of joke. "You can't be serious. For what?" "Embezzlement, fraud, and misuse of HOA funds," the officer replied. "Please stand up." For the first time in all the weeks he had been dealing with her, he saw real fear in Karen's eyes. She tried to argue. She tried to stall. She looked around the room as if expecting someone, anyone, to defend her. But there was no one left. As the officers pulled her hands behind her back and snapped the cuffs into place, someone in the back of the room let out a low, satisfied whistle. A few people clapped. Most just watched, wide-eyed, as Karen was escorted out the door, her reign over the neighborhood finally, irreversibly over. In the days that followed, things began to change. The HOA was completely restructured, with new leadership elected by actual community votes rather than Karen's backroom deals. The ridiculous, arbitrary fines were rescinded, and all outstanding debts imposed by Karen's administration were wiped clean. The absurd restrictions she had enforced with an iron grip, no parking in driveways, mandatory attendance at meetings, bans on garage doors being painted the wrong shade, were all abolished. The most surreal part was watching the neighborhood itself shift. People who had once ignored him, who had once gone out of their way to pretend he didn't exist, were suddenly making eye contact. Some even greeted him. Others looked embarrassed, as if realizing, far too late, that they had been complicit in something they now wished to distance themselves from. He didn't care about their guilt. He wasn't looking for apologies. What mattered was that Karen was gone. The final piece of closure came a few weeks later when he noticed the real estate sign in front of Karen's old house. For sale. She hadn't just been removed from the HOA. She had left entirely, whether by choice or by force. He didn't know where she had gone, and he didn't care. All that mattered was that she was no longer here, no longer poisoning the air of the neighborhood with her petty cruelty and unchecked control. One evening, as he walked down the street, he caught a glimpse of a few neighbors standing outside, chatting with one another. He could still feel the remnants of what had happened. There was an uneasiness in the air, a recognition that things had gone too far. But for the first time since moving in, he felt something close to peace. This was his home now. Not just a house, not just a place where he happened to live, but truly his home. And this time, no one could take it away from him. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for more gripping stories, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. Thanks for watching.